Right, so now we are getting back to Psalm 83. So that was kind of the intro we went through last time. And we're going to pick up right in with Psalm 83, verse 1. So it says, a song or psalm of Asaph. Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. Now, we had mentioned before that Asaph lived around the time of David. That is about, for our purposes, 3,000 years ago. He wrote Psalm 73 all the way to Psalm 83. And what he's asking for in this psalm is destruction of those who want to see Israel destroyed. Now, again, some people say, well, this is because of the history of the victory of Jehoshaphat whenever he went back in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. And well, that may be true, except that all the nations listed here were not all the nations that were involved in that battle in 2 Chronicles 20. And we also don't see the outcomes of what happens to these nations, of what Asaph is asking for to happen. We don't see that happen to those nations. And this psalm, it isn't accredited to a descendant of Asaph. It's accredited to Asaph. He says that's who wrote the psalm. And Asaph, it's important to make the distinction because Asaph himself is described as a prophet, as a seer, okay? So in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 30, it says, moreover, Hezekiah the king and the princes commanded the Levites to sing praise unto the Lord with the words of David and Asaph the seer, okay? So whenever they would sing these psalms, it says, and they sang praise with gladness and they bowed their heads in worship. So he said that you need to sing praises of David, which we know is the king, and of this prophet Asaph. So we have to recognize Asaph is considered a prophet to the ancient Israel, to ancient Israel. So if Asaph is the author of this psalm can only really be seen as prophetic. Now, David, during the time David ruled, he had already conquered these lands. He conquered the Philistines. He conquered Edom. He conquered Ammon. He conquered Moab. Okay? He conquered Syria, the land that was previously Assyria. They weren't his enemies at that time. So it would be very strange to say, hey, guess what? Those guys are coming after us. If you had just conquered them, what do you mean they're coming after us, right? It'd be like saying, Virginia is attacking America. What do you mean? That's part of America. They were all paying tribute to David, as it were. So this is telling you this is a yet future event. So in verse 2 and 3, it says in Psalm 83, for lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. Now, the words crafty counsel, think of it like precision planning. Crafty counsel is, if you're going to directly translate it, means making naked, all right? They want to see Israel be defeated, and they're going to somehow strip away the defenses of Israel. A few months ago, we saw one of the most high-tech borders destroyed, overwhelmed, and led to one of the biggest losses of life in Israel since the Holocaust, to Jews since the Holocaust. All done with extremely high-tech weaponry, right? I mean, the walls they broke through were electronically defended with many measures that were all overcome very quickly. They breached these walls, and then now, if you look at the Houthis, you look at Hezbollah, you look at these different areas, they all have precision-guided missiles, right? You look at Iran today, they have hypersonic missiles. Does anyone know how long it would take them to get from Iran to Israel?
400 seconds.
Which is how many minutes?
60 minutes.
And how many seconds?
6 seconds. 66.
It's 606.6 seconds. It's just interesting, right? 666 or something seconds. Anyways, just interesting numbers. So again, they've done all this. All of these enemies have armed themselves specifically to overwhelm Israel's defenses, right? Or they've made naked Israel's defenses. So again, if this is speaking of some old historical event, we're unaware of it. We don't know of any historical time where they were able to sit there and precision plan an attack against Israel as this big conglomeration. So what about, he says, they've taken crafty counsel and they've consulted against thy hidden ones. Now, the hidden ones of God, right? That means they're inaccessible to the world. They are hidden by God. They are the people that God, no matter how persecuted and how many times the world has tried to wipe them out, they cannot do it. They cannot have complete victory, right? Because God protected them. You remember Balaam, who was hired by Balak to try and come and curse Israel so that they could wipe them out? He actually is the one who gave them the title, the hidden ones, right? So in Numbers chapter 23, verse 8, he says, how shall I curse whom God hath not cursed? How shall I defy whom the Lord hath not defied? For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. Lo, the people shall dwell alone, and shall not be reckoned among the nations. Think about what he just said there. He's like, how am I supposed to stand against the ones that God's not against? Everywhere I look, he's there around them. He's surrounding them. He will not let it happen. The people shall dwell alone. Nobody can touch them as a people. Doesn't mean individuals can't die. Obviously they have. And shall not be reckoned among the nations. No one will be successful in wiping them out. That's a promise between God and them. Psalm 83 verse 4 continues on, talking about this alliance coming against Israel. They have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. So the goal of this confederacy, based on that statement, would you say it's a two-state solution? Doesn't sound like it, right? At least not what's saying here. They said, let's cut them off from being a nation. Let's get them off the map. We do not need a Jewish state here. That's the view they're taking. Now, they want to take the land of Israel and return it to the Arab world, which again, it did fall in the same region of the Arab world for a long period of time. But if you go way back in history, the nation of Israel preceded many of these other nations, at least their claim on that land. So when we go through the list of nations that we see here, and we look at a map, you're going to find that these nations surround Israel geographically. And frankly, throughout history, from many people's point of view, Israel has been a type of thorn in the side of the Middle East since it's been reestablished there in 1948. And it's not just that like Israel's been really evil and that's why, you know, they're getting what they get. There is a spiritual drive against Israel. There's a force against Israel where the devil from day one has been trying to thwart God's plan for the world. And of course, when we talk about Israel blessing the world, we're not talking about the nation providing exports to the world. We're talking about the blessing of the world that came through the nation of Israel. And what is that blessing? It's free salvation to all. And it only came through one man, Jesus Christ, born a Jew, but paid for the sins of the world.
I was listening to somebody that's a Muslim, they think, yeah, they see Jesus as a prophet, but they see him as an arrow.
Mhm.
Like, what?
Well, again, the reason, even from ancient times, why was Israel such a thorn in the side? Well, you got to remember, way back when, not everybody believed in the God of all creation. There were many different gods, and I put that in quotes, where people would believe what they wanted. And of course, they're gods that people designed after their own lusts, after their own hearts. And here you have this God of Israel that's speaking the truth, speaking against tyranny, speaking against the value of the individual, speaking against child sacrifice, speaking against adultery, against murder. I mean, if you look at any nation that's a victor, what do? They rape, they devastate, they destroy anyone that they want. And God is saying, listen, even though some nations were wiped out, man, woman, and child, but the point was when people were captured, they still had certain rights. They were treated in certain ways. You had to behave in a certain way, and you were held accountable even if you injured your own servant. So here's somebody speaking against this tyranny, and of course it makes these other nations very enraged. This is in ancient times. Now, the light of his judgment, right, shone a light on their darkness. So they're going to stand against it. But it's not, again, Satan has been trying forever, for the longest time, to defeat God. But if he can't defeat God, what is his second best option? Well, wipe out those who are his children, or those in general who are created in his image. He wants to destroy all humanity. Make no mistake, you reject God, you're not Satan's buddy. He still hates you as much as he did if you were to accept God. The difference is God has assigned himself. He has attached himself to this nation Israel. He made a promise to Abraham and later to David. And on top of that promise he made to Eve, right? He's attached himself to this nation. So guess what? Satan wants to do all that he can to stop it and to destroy that nation if he can. Now, again, I'm not trying to argue that Israel has done everything right. Most of its history has been opposed to God. There's no question, opposed to the will of God. They even crucified the Messiah, them and the Romans that were occupying at that time. Now, again, but they still remain the people of God, and they still have a destiny that God is very much involved in. Now, God has made some promises, and he is not one to change his word. He will keep his word. So we're going to see now what the world is going to do is these group of nations are going to try to break God's promise. If we can wipe out Israel, then God's promises can never happen. That's Satan's viewpoint of it. And these nations, of course, are going to try to fulfill that, unknowing that they're trying to do the bidding of this world and of Satan.
Well, I think there's something to that. God told Israel about the time, the judges, because they did not wipe off
Yes,
these people. That the people in the land would be a
thorn in their side. Yeah, that's exactly right. And for those of you who might not have heard,
I think this happened even today.
Mhm.
They're always thorn in Israel's side. You can't wipe them out if you're a thorn.
yeah, in all the same regions, that's correct. So even in the land of Israel, what our brother Leonard was just saying was the areas of Israel that are still troublesome parts for Israel, where there's still, other groups there, were actually the same areas that they were told you need to fight these people off as you move into the land and take over the land. You need to take over these areas, and this is where they failed. And that's exactly right. It remains a problem today as a thorn in their side. So verse 5 picks up in Psalm 83. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. Talking about against God. They're trying to come together, not against just Israel, but against God. So if there's one thing that unites the world, it's their hatred of God. The world hates God and anyone that attaches to God. Okay, the people of God. Now, don't ever forget, Jesus, the hatred of Jesus, was what united Herod and Pilate, who previously were enemies. In Luke 23:12, it says, in the same day, Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were in enmity between themselves. That's because they were sending Jesus back and forth for trials that were all illegal anyway, but for trials to try to put him to death. So these nations, they make this agreement or this treaty to stand up together against Israel. So in verse 6, it says, the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites of Moab and the Hagarenes. So Edom today includes the Arabs in southern Jordan, where the Ishmaelites represent much of Saudi Arabia. And Moab, again, goes back to that area of Jordan. The Hagarenes, there's two different groups here, that involves the people who are descendants perhaps of Hagar, right, which would be settled in Egypt, and specifically also east of Jerusalem, which would be what we would consider the West Bank. So in 1 Chronicles 15:10, it says, and in the days of Saul, they made war with the Hagarites, who fell by their hand, and they dwelt in their tents throughout all the east land of Gilead. So we're talking to the east of Israel now. So that's Hagar comes from Egypt, and also her descendants seem to be organized in that area, if it's the same Hagar. So then it says in verse 7, Jabal and Ammon and Amalek and the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. So Jabal is represented by what we now call the Lebanese people, which my heritage is Lebanese. And specifically, there's a group of Lebanese who support terrorist activities, I guess you call it, against Israel, where they're trying to attack Israel for what they feel are oppressions. And of course, that group is called Hezbollah. And in Joshua 13, verse 5, which our brother mentioned here, says the land of the Giblites and all Lebanon. So this is what's telling you that Jabal is part of Lebanon. That's in Joshua 13:5, toward the sun rising from Baal Gad under Mount Hermon into the entering of Hamath. So we have the Lebanese people now represented, as well as Jordan and Saudi Arabia so far. And then we says Ammon, which Ammon is settling around the capital of Jordan. So Ammon and Moab, does anybody remember who their ancestor was? Lot, right, when his daughters got him drunk and essentially they raped him. And then Amalek, he lived near Sinai, and they were ancient enemies of Israel. So we got the people in Jordan, and now we have the people near Sinai. And then finally, the Philistines, where did they live? Well, I'll give you a hint. One of their main cities is called Gaza. That's right. One of the lords of the Philistines. There were 5 major cities like Gath, where we know Goliath was from, and then of course Gaza. And then lastly, Tyre on this verse was found in southern Lebanon, and it's a city that has all kinds of interesting history, which you can read about in the Bible. So then you get to verse 8. It says, Asher also is joined with them, and they have holpen the children of Lot, Selah. So Asher involves the areas of Iraq and Syria, mainly Syria, but also a little bit of Iraq. Now, all of these joined together with the children of Lot that were previously mentioned as Moab and Ammon, right? So in total, the nations of today that we see involved in this confederation is going to be like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, okay, or Palestine as we call it, Iraq, and Syria. These are the most likely nations involved in this prophecy and in this confederation against Israel. Now, every one of these nations, again, historically, has stood against Israel at different parts. And Israel has stood against these nations. They've attacked each other back and forth, as history kind of tells us, between all countries. And sometimes there's been small alliances, and sometimes those nations have fought against one another. So it's not like there's ever been this great peace over that whole region. But as far as we can tell from biblical history and from most history books, none of them really joined together all at once for a single concerted effort that was extremely well planned, where Israel really thought they were about to be wiped off as a nation, right? Now, today, Egypt is at a peace treaty with Israel. Jordan is at a peace treaty with Israel. Saudi Arabia was about to enter a peace treaty with Israel when all of this happened. I think it was on October 7th with this attack on Israel. So, with all that being what it is, I don't think this psalm correlates with those historical events of Chronicles, because in the historical event of Chronicles, we had the Ammonites and the Moabites fighting against the Edomites at the time, right? Against those in Mount Seir. Whereas in this battle, they're all fighting together against Israel. We have a different situation. So I don't think this is a historical psalm at all. Now, again, some people say, well, no, it's prophetic for sure, but it was already fulfilled back in 1948 when Israel was first established as a nation. Okay, so in 1948, when Israel fought for its independence, all of these nations were partially involved. In the 1960s as well, during the 6-Day War, we know that a lot of these nations were involved, specifically Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, and minimally Lebanon. They sent 2 planes. Probably all we had. But the point is they sent 2 planes for the battle. So there was a confederacy there. And again, their motive was the same, to wipe out Israel. But again, the complete confederacy of all these nations has yet to happen. So I don't believe the Bible prophecies kind of, or close to, or sort of. I think it means what it says, and it says what it means. When it lists the nations, I believe all the nations are going to be involved. And when it lists the outcomes, I believe the outcomes are going to be involved. So what are the outcomes that Asaph is praying for? Well, we start with verse 9. It says, do unto them as the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin, at the brook of Kison, which perished at Endor, and they became as dung for the earth. So the Midianites, they were an ancient enemy to Israel. And God actually commands Moses, I want you to take vengeance on them, right? So he actually sends 1,000 from each of the tribes of Israel in order to deal with them. Now, the Midianites, does anyone know who they come from? Whose children they were?
Oh,
Don't say Midian. Don't say Midian.
Midian, Midian.
So his wife, Keturah, right? So they were there. They were obviously this offspring of this group of Midianites. And they had been the ones, remember whenever they were going on their way to Egypt and they found a guy in a well and they bought him and then they sold him to the Ishmaelites? This is the people who purchased Joseph, right? From his brothers, if you remember that story. And whenever Israel was coming back to the land, this is the same group that hired Balaam to come and curse Israel. And whenever he couldn't curse them under his advice, they took their wives and their daughters and said, hey, go out there and flirt and get these men to commit adultery with you so that their God will judge them. And of course, there was a great judgment. So through the commanded revenge of God, he actually sent 12,000 of each tribe, 1,000 of each tribe, and they wiped out thousands upon thousands of these Midianites. Okay, that's described in Numbers 31. But they still remained a problem during the time of the judges. Okay, so the Midianites, during the time of the judges, they had oppressed Israel for 7 years. And that's when this fellow named Gideon shows up. All right, and he was sent to deal with them. And do we know how many of them he killed? He killed, huh? A gob, exactly. 120,000 Midianites. So in Judges chapter 8, verse 10, it says, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their hosts with them, about 15,000 men, all that were left of all the hosts of the children of the east, for there fell 120,000 men that drew the sword. So they diminished their population to almost nothing before attacking those two guys with their last 15,000 men after 120,000 were killed. They were completely wiped out and erased from history. Sisera is mentioned as a captain of the Canaanites, and Jabin was the king of the Canaanites. Here's another group. And they oppressed Israel not for 7 years, but for 20 years. And they were ruling over Israel with 900 chariots of iron. That's a weapon of war Israel had no defense against. And of course, Deborah gets approached by Barak. He's like, hey, what am I supposed to do here? She's like, go, you'll beat him. He's like, I ain't going if you're not going. She's like, if I go, then a woman's going to have the glory for all this, not you. So he's like, that's fine with me. You come in anyway. So of course, Deborah goes with him. And she went, and the entire army, including the 900 chariots, were destroyed, and no one survived. So in Judges chapter 4, verse 16, sorry, Jeff.
Story, and apparently God sent all this rain,
Mhm.
everything was muddy, and the chariots were
Got stuck.
worthless.
Yeah, they were of no value.
So they were slaughtered. I mean, they were just like, they were trapped in the mud, and here comes the Gideon and his army.
It's almost like God knows what he means, right? He does what he says. So in Judges 4:16, it says, Barak pursued after the chariots and after the host unto Harosheth of the Gentiles, and all the host of Sisera fell upon the edge of the sword, and there was not a man left. How complete was that victory? Sisera was nailed to the ground by the wife of his buddy, right? Of his friend, and the king was annihilated. Judges 4:24 says, and the hand of the children of Israel prospered and prevailed against Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. So what's the request of Asaph so far in Psalm 83? He wants to see his enemies completely annihilated so that they never trouble Israel again, just as we had taken care of Jabin, just like we had taken care of the Midianites, right? So that's a pretty big question. And then finally, he said he wants them to become fertilizer for the fields, become like dung for the fields, fertilizer. Thousands upon thousands of them would die and litter the land, right? Just as what happened to these enemies. Now, if something like that were to happen, if all these nations were to come against Israel, and Israel were to have complete victory, as is every war throughout history, when people win wars, they annex territory. I know we don't think about it these days, but that was true even in Israel's history. They take the Sinai Peninsula, they take different areas. Sometimes they give it back in treaties and whatnot, but it's very common when you win a battle, you occupy area. Look at Germany, right? East Berlin, West Berlin. This is something that in our lifetimes, we've seen the wall finally come down and Germany kind of be restored to what it was meant to be. But all of these things, it's not uncommon to take land. So imagine if Israel fights this battle and all of a sudden is removing their defenses, moving their Iron Dome, reestablishing new areas, doing all this stuff. They might think, well, great, all of our enemies are not here. They would let their guard down to move their military around. And guess what? Another group of enemies might show up. The Ezekiel 38 enemies, which we read about last time, might seize that opportunity and say, let's look at the unwalled villages. Look, they're defenseless. Now's the time. And they go and they attack. All these people are there. Now, again, is that exactly how it'll happen? We don't know. But you can certainly see where something like that is feasible, right? So guess we will probably stop here. And we'll pick up next time in verse 11. And we'll see whether we can get it all done in one session next time, and then we'll start in Acts. Any final thoughts on those first 10 verses of Psalm 83?
Well, when you talk about, David defeating all his enemies,
Mhm.
well, he was just a kid when he defeated the Philistines. He did that by himself.
Yeah, well, he defeated the giant, you mean, or what? Yeah, it's funny, I don't know.
Well,
Here's the question I have for you.
That's the guy.
Here's a question I have for you about that, though, before you continue. How old was David when he defeated Goliath?
14.
I would encourage everyone to look into that, see what you think next time we talk. How old was he at that point?
He wasn't 55.
He wasn't 55, that's the truth, that's for sure.
Well,
Hey, what were you finishing up? Go ahead.
when, she was talking about how the chariots all got stuck in the mud.
Mhm.
Well, I was thinking that that's the same thing that happened to Germans when the Russians ran them over. The
Yeah.
Germans were 15 miles outside of Moscow when the weather froze up. And the general gave the orders to open up the gates and let the Russians out. And they mowed over the German army 15 miles outside of
Well,
Moscow.
so that tells you one thing, military might does not determine victory, right? All the power in the world doesn't determine it. God determines who the victor is. That's the truth. All right, guys, we'll pick up next time. Thanks for hanging out.